The United States had extensive railroad networks both before and after the Civil War. The first transcontinental railroad was finished in 1869. More than 200,000 miles of rail lines crossed the country by 1890. Cornelius Vanderbilt played a significant role in the development of local railroads. By joining local railroads into a bigger network, he connected the Midwest and New York. Many Americans were able to travel large distances because to railroads. Construction and maintenance of the railroads, however, were challenging and hazardous jobs. Chinese, Irish, and desperate unemployed Civil War veterans were among those who carried out the majority of the labor. Railroad builders were impacted by accidents and illnesses. More than 2,000 laborers had perished by 1888. 20,000 more employees had sustained injuries. Eventually, railroads connected the nation's several areas. Railroad schedules, however, proved difficult to adhere to because each settlement set its own hours, primarily based on the path of the sun. For instance, the time in Boston was nearly 12 minutes later than the time in New York. Officials came up with a plan to divide the Earth's surface into 24 time zones, one for each hour of the day, in order to solve this issue. The United States would be divided into 4 time zones under this proposal: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Everyone who resides in a certain zone would observe the same time. The railroad companies were in favor of this scheme. Numerous communities also did. Long-distance travel was made simpler by railroads, which also aided in the expansion of numerous industries. The necessity for their products by the railroads contributed to the growth of the iron, steel, coal, lumber, and glass industries. Railroads also boosted commerce between cities and towns. Many communities were able to develop and prosper as a result. New communities were created thanks to railroads. George M. Pullman constructed a plant on a prairie outside of Chicago in 1880. The sleeping cars Pullman created for trains were manufactured by workers. Pullman constructed a sizable village to house his workers as demand for his automobiles increased. The lodging was excellent, but he made an effort to manage the lives of the employees. They finally rebelled. The opportunity to get wealthy was provided by the railroad sector, which attracted a lot of criminals. A well-known instance of corruption happened in 1864 when a group of Union Pacific Railroad owners established a building business named Crédit Mobilier. They awarded this business a contract to build railroad track at a price that was 2 to 3 times what it actually cost. All profits were kept by them. They granted some members of Congress stock in order to deter government interference. Authorities eventually learned about the scam. Farmers were one group offended by railroad industry corruption. For a variety of reasons, farmers were angry. First, they said that rather than selling government land grants to families, railways sold them to enterprises. Additionally, they charged that excessive shipping costs established by the railroad sector kept farmers in debt. They claimed that railroads imposed various fees on their clients. The Grangers engaged in political activity in response to these violations. They succeeded in persuading several states to enact legislation that governed railroad activities. Members of the railroad industry contested the state's authority to control them. In 1877, the Supreme Court heard the case. The Supreme Court ruled in the case of Munn v. Illinois that private companies could be regulated by the government to serve the public interest. The battle had been lost by the railroads. Congress enacted the Interstate Commerce Act 10 years later. The act granted the government of the United States the authority to monitor railroad operations and other measures, but the railroad firms persisted in opposing any government action. The nation experienced an economic downturn starting in 1893. Numerous institutions were impacted, notably the railroads. Many railroad firms were unsuccessful. They were consequently seized by banking institutions. Most of the country's railways were owned by 7 corporations by 1900.